Yes.
Professor Ludlam, I'm going to be asking you next about product usage and treatment policies in the period 1980 to 1984. First of all, in terms of the annual returns that were completed and sent to Oxford, was that your responsibility at that time?
It was my responsibility. I didn't actually do all the work for it. I had staff, clerical and other staff who did most of the work.
Do you know where the annual returns were kept? The reason I ask, Professor, is that we haven't got any for Edinburgh Royal Infirmary for the 80s.
I'm amazed to hear that. That they should be in the fairly extensive archives that are with the Health Board in the University Library. I'm amazed. I can't understand why you haven't got those. I was obsessional about collecting these things. It's possible, I suppose, that if you like, the top copy was sent off to Oxford, and we didn't keep a photocopy. Photocopiers were not very common in the early 1980s. I'm sorry. The data you get from the national database, I think, will be pretty accurate as a reflection. So I'm sorry, I don't have the.
Yes, the information that the annual returns would give us that we don't have from elsewhere currently, at least, would be the number of patients actually treated in a given year. But you've estimated that in your witness statement. Well, you've estimated in your witness statement, first of all, in paragraph 59, that you think there are about 40 to 50 patients with severe bleeding disorders and approximately 150 to 200 patients with non-severe disorders. And
Yes.
That's your best recollection. We'll look at one document which may assist. Shamit, could we have PRSE 304349? This is, if we go to the second page, please. This is your response to Professor Bloom's AIDS survey. I'm not asking you about the detail of that, at least not at the moment, but we can just see numbers here. How many haemophiliacs are treated each year at your centre, e.g. in 1982? And the answer that's been given is 60 haemophilia A, 16 haemophilia B, 7 von Willebrand's disease. Now, it's not clear, I think, from the form whether you're giving that information for 82 or 83, but would that be broadly reflective of the kind of numbers that were being treated on an annual basis at that time?
Yes.
Now, in terms of the source of products that you used, NHS concentrates were supplied to you by the Protein Fractionation Centre in Liberton, is that right?
That's where they were manufactured. They were supplied by the local blood bank in the Royal Infirmary.
So the PFC would provide them to the blood bank, and then you would access them from the blood bank. And
yes.
Am I right in understanding that there was no charge for those products to the health board or the hospital? They were effectively free of charge to you?
Yes.
What can you recall in the early 80s about how PFC allocated concentrates to particular blood banks or particular geographical regions?
In the early 1980s, I think it was on the basis of the amount of plasma that the Edinburgh region, which was southeast Scotland, could submit to the Protein Fractionation Centre for making into factor VIII concentrate and other blood products.
Okay, well, we'll have a look at a couple of documents that might assist. Shomik, could we first of all have PRSE 40144? So we can see from the top of the page, Professor Ludlam, this is a meeting of directors of the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service and Haemophilia directors, 30th of January 81, and we can see that you are in attendance. Could we go to page 3, please, Shomik? And if we could zoom in on the heading development of a new approach and the paragraphs beneath that. So we can see it says there, Professor Ludlam, development of a new approach to regional issues of factor VIII concentrate from PFC. Mr. Watt invited members to consider a proposal that each region should get back quantities of blood products in proportion to the amount of plasma sent to the PFC for processing, rather than by the present method, whereby factor VIII was distributed on the basis of population. Haemophilia directors expressed reservations about this proposal, and the chairman referred to the central funding of the blood transfusion service in Scotland compared with the strong regional element in the English service. In general, members agreed that Mr. Watt should continue to maintain a reserved supply of factor VIII at the PFC, and were of the view that while issues of VIII should be related to the amount of plasma submitted for processing, it was for the transfusion service to rationalise the collection of plasma appropriately. Now, pausing there, Professor, it looks from the first paragraph as though, as at early 1981, factor VIII was distributed according to population rather than amount of plasma sent. And then there's a proposal to change that. Do you recall that at all?
I don't recall the change, but I recall discussions in about 1981 in which I remember calculating how much factor VIII I would receive because I knew how much plasma was being collected in southeast Scotland. So I think it did verge towards that system, although there is, in a sense, in this paragraph, the suggestion that there could be some movement of supplies around Scotland between health boards.
We see from the second paragraph it says haemophilia directors expressed reservations about this proposal. Can you recall whether you had reservations about it or what those reservations might have been from others?
Well, I think we wanted, as haemophilia directors, to offer as good a service as we could to our patients and to be able to offer them as much concentrate as we could, particularly NHS concentrate. And we wanted it to be an equitable service throughout Scotland. Without knowledge of the details, it may be that it was harder to collect plasma in the west of Scotland per head of the population, perhaps, than in some of the smaller health boards, smaller blood transfusion regions. There's an interesting statistic that I remember from many years ago is the number of donations you get in a blood transfusion centre is inversely proportional to the size of the population it serves. In other words, a small population is much more likely per head to give more blood than a larger population. That made large areas perhaps not produce quite as much per head of the population as the smaller areas.
There is a later letter, May 1982, PRSE 0003044, please, Shomik. we can see it's dated the 10th of May 1982. It's from Dr. Bolton, and it's addressed to you. We just need to look at the last paragraph on this page, please, Shemik, for present purposes. We can see from that last paragraph, it says, as you know, this allocation, which is the allocation from PFC, is actually based on the amount of plasma we supply to PFC. Does that suggest that by May 1982, the system has changed, so that it's now an amount that's proportionate to the, or is somehow based upon the amount of plasma supplied?
It does, I would agree.
Can we just go back for a moment to PRSE 40144 at page 3? The previous screen, Shomek. Thank you. I'm looking at paragraph 5 and a little puzzled by what was actually meant by the last sentence. What has been discussed, the context, as it seems to me at the moment, is that it's recognised that in England the blood is collected on a regional basis and some plasma is then sent into BPL for the production of the various products that come from the plasma. But Mr. Watt continued to maintain a reserved supply of factor VIII, whatever that may mean precisely, and of the view that while issues of factor VIII should be related to the amount of plasma, in England it was directly proportional to. And then it says this: it was for the transfusion service to rationalise the collection of plasma appropriately. One way of reading that, in the light of the context, would be, well, we're not going to impose a system where whatever you send in, you get a proportional amount back. But we're going to ask, because it's centrally managed, we're going to ask the transfusion service to make sure it gets enough plasma from its particular area in order to produce enough product for that area. So that it's a rather different slant on the system. Now, have I understood it correctly or not, or is that the meaning that you took from it? It looks as though it might have been worded because there had been some disagreement, and this is a form of consensus statement which could mean different things to different observers. But so I'm interested in what you would take from it.
I'm having some difficulty. This last sentence of the paragraph starts in general members agreed. The amount of plasma submitted for processing, it was for the transfusion service. I agree, it says to rationalise the collection of plasma appropriate. My interpretation is that it was up to the PFC to try and top up those haemophilia centres, if I can put it that way, that don't get as much factor VIII because the plasma from that area is less than elsewhere.
Yes.
Does that help?
Well, it does help. It's just trying to understand what is a slightly impenetrable sentence.
Yes, and maybe that's a question that we'll be able to explore further with SNBTS and PFC witnesses in due course.
I'm sure we can, but it's I'd be interested to know what the answer is.
Professor Ludlam, again dealing with source of products, Cryo Precipitate, did you receive that through the same route, in other words, supplied by the PFC to the blood bank in the infirmary and then obtained by you from there?
No, the Cryo Precipitate was prepared by the blood transfusion service locally in Edinburgh and stored in the deep freezes of the blood bank in the hospital. It wasn't from PFC. It's the the plasma that wasn't used for making cryoprecipitate, and also the cryoprecipitate supernatant that was sent to PFC for processing.
And then in terms of commercial concentrates, and we'll look at precise proportions in a few minutes, but when you did use commercial concentrates, what was the arrangement for their purchase or procurement in the early 80s?
In the early 80s, they were purchased by the blood transfusion service, and Lothian Health Board paid for the concentrate.
And who decided which commercial concentrate to purchase? Factor 8, Co-8, whichever. Whose decision was that?
I can't remember exactly, but what I do remember is that it was sometimes quite difficult to buy commercial concentrates in the early 1980s. There was generally a shortage, and the commercial suppliers were keen to supply the big centres. They had contractual arrangements with the big centres in England, and it was sometimes quite difficult, actually, to get hold of Factor 8. I'm sorry, I can't remember. Probably I made the decision. It might have been someone in the blood transfusion, but it's probably me. And to some extent, it would depend on what was available.
To what extent in the first half of the 1980s did you receive visits from representatives of pharmaceutical companies? We've seen examples in relation to other centres, and I think you'll have seen one document, Professor, of showing you being visited by Mr. Berry of Immuno in 1984. Was that a regular feature?
No, they didn't see Edinburgh as a market, as it were, for their products. So I don't recall receiving visits.
We're going to look at a document which was a written submission or case for the appointment of a dedicated haemophilia nurse. Seamus, it's LOTH 40216, please. We go to the next page. We can see there's an agenda for a area executive group meeting of the Lothian Health Board. And then if we go on another 2 pages, please. You'll see there, Professor Ludlam, a document headed Lothian Health Board, Area Executive Group, 7th of December 1982, case for the appointment of a staff nurse, Edinburgh Haemophilia Centre. If we look down the page, we can see that this page sets out the case for the appointment of a nurse dedicated to the Haemophilia Centre. And if we look at the bottom paragraph, we can see it said this: the case is now promoted as a development which should be self-financing, in that the employment of a staff nurse would be expected to result in a significant reduction in the use of Factor 8, and particularly result in a reduction in the use of commercial Factor 8, which is presently required to supplement the allocation of intermediate. It says Factor 3 there, I think it's probably supposed to be Factor 8. And then if we go to the next page, please, Seamus. We can see that from the bottom of the page, it's authored by a Dr. Ogilvie, community medicine specialist. But then if we go back up to the top half of the page, thank you, that's perfect. We can see that it says the present requirement for Factor 8 concentrate is approximately 130,000 IU per month, while the allocation of Factor 8 from PFC to the Edinburgh Haemophilia Centre is only 84,000 IU. So that would suggest a shortfall of some 46,000. And then it said the difference has to be made up by the purchase of commercial factor VIII at a cost of £2,500 per month. It's considered that the home supervision of haemophiliacs will significantly reduce the total demand for factor VIII, since it is frequently inadequate supervision which results in the need for hospitalisation and the consequential use of factor VIII in high dosage. It is anticipated that the better supervision of haemophiliacs could be achieved by the employment of a staff nurse, would result in at least a 15% reduction in factor VIII consumption, amounting to a reduction of about 20,000 IU per month, which is equivalent to a saving of about 12,000 per year. And then if we skip down a couple of paragraphs, it says it's understood that commercial blood products to treat haemophiliacs to the value of about 40,000 was purchased in the first half of this financial year. And then there's a recommendation for the appointment of a staff nurse. And I think we know from your statement a staff nurse was appointed in 1982. Now, this wasn't authored by you, but would the data in here and the arguments in here have come from you, do you think?
I think it's likely that the information came from me about the purchase of factor VIII, commercial factor VIII, and the allocations of NHS and commercial, yes.
So this would suggest that there is a shortfall of PFC of about 46,000 IU in terms of allocation per month. And there's also a suggestion that patients are effectively receiving too much factor VIII. And the aim is to reduce the amount of factor VIII required. Can you perhaps help us with the thinking in relation to that, please, Professor?
Yes. I was only going to receive funding for this post if it was going to be lead to a lower expenditure by the health board on haemophilia. And otherwise I wouldn't have got this post. So I suggested that maybe, as is set out here, if patients treated themselves at home, because early treatment of bleeds requires less treatment. That's not only well established, but it results in the bleed getting better quicker and there being less joint damage. So that's good medicine. And you need smaller doses if you treat early. So if people went on to home therapy, they might well require less factor VIII than delaying for 6 or 12 hours to get up to hospital, then requiring more factor VIII.
Did the increased supervision of home treatment that came with the appointment of the haemophilia sister have the result of less factor VIII being used in the way anticipated here?
I don't remember, I don't recall looking at the statistics, but I was very surprised 6 months after this request was granted and the haemophilia sister was in post, the health board treasurer wrote to me and asked how much we had spent on commercial factor VIII. I think the expectation was that I would save, I forget, £10,000 in 6 months. And as the way things had worked out, because it's very difficult to make predictions in haemophilia, I had saved £20,000 apparently on commercial factor VIII. And so I wrote back to the health board treasurer. I didn't hear from him again.
We're going to look at the specific figures that were presented to the...
Just 1 moment before we do. The document on the screen, the second paragraph, I just want to have a look at that. What you've described, I think, is that having more patients treating themselves at home early with factor VIII, recognizing a bleed, treating it early, would avoid the need for them to come into hospital would avoid the need for greater use of factor VIII, and therefore is less wasteful, or uses less factor VIII than requiring them to come to hospital and have it there. It's what is said in the first sentence, how that fits with that, because there it says that home supervision of haemophiliacs will significantly reduce the total demand for factor VIII, since it is frequently inadequate supervision that results in the need for hospitalization. So what was the failure of supervision that resulted in the need for people to come to hospital to treat a bleed? I don't quite understand how that fits with what you've just described. It's not your letter, so it may be somebody's misunderstood what you were saying, but...
Yes, the best I can do to help you is that patients on home treatment sometimes end up treating themselves for several days on end ineffectively without coming out to hospital. I'm sorry, mostly patients treat themselves well at home. It isn't a difficulty, but it's important that they are educated properly, that good records are kept, that the arrangements for them collecting or having delivered their factor VIII, it all requires to be carefully arranged, let me put it that way.
So it might be that if better supervised, they wouldn't run out of the factor VIII that they keep in their fridge, and they'll be able to maintain themselves better at home. Is that the sort of point that's being made?
Yes. It's a mechanistic arrangement.
Yes, I see. Thank you very much.
We're just going to look at the figures in terms of product usage that were supplied to the Penrose inquiry. Shamit, could we have PRSE 302887, please? We can see this is a report dated April 2012 from the National Haemophilia Database, Bleeding Disorder Statistics for the Penrose Inquiry. And if we could go, please, Shamik, to page 15. Yep. So we can see there we have the figures for Edinburgh from the 1969 through to 1977. I'm not going to take you to each and every line, Professor Ludlam, but in an attempt to summarise this, we can see there's a substantial increase in the use of cryoprecipitate from 1970, which is the fourth line down in the table, where we see 6,350 units being used. And if we go by way of example to the bottom of the page, we can see for 1977, third line from the bottom, cryoprecipitate 640,640 units. And we can see that there are no commercial concentrates being used at all during this period. And then if we go over to the next page, we can see the first 7 lines give us the information for 1978 and 1979. Again, we can see substantial use of cryoprecipitate. The figures there in the first and fifth lines give us the cryoprecipitate figures. We can see an increasing use of factor VIII from PFC, but still less than cryoprecipitate. And again, no commercial concentrates. So if we then pick the picture up in 1980, which is when you took over, Professor, which is the 8th line down, we can see cryoprecipitate 1,212,470. And then we see being used factor VIII, so a commercial factor VIII, 164,000 units. We'll ignore the small amounts of FFP. And then also in 1980, PFC factor VIII, 1.6 million approximately. So is it right to say that in relation to 1980, we can see a significantly increased use of both cryoprecipitate and, in particular, factor concentrates, and the first use of commercial concentrates.
Yes.
If we then carry on it with 1981, we can see there again the figure in relation to cryoprecipitate, 720,000, so that's coming down. We can see some commercial product being used still, factor 8, 442,000, so that's gone up. And PFC factor 8, 840,000. So a significant increase in that year in the use of commercial concentrates. Is that fair?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty. Well, that's better, thank you. I'm sure.
There's a shorter table I can probably take it from, if that's easier.
The shorter table, I think, would be more helpful if it's the one that you've sent.
We'll look at that in just a moment, because it distills this information. But can I just draw your attention to, we see Ddavp with an asterisk featuring for the first time in 1982. That's what this table tells us. Okay. Right, if we go to the shorter table,
Could I just say
yes,
about Ddavp that its use is not well recorded by the annual returns, if I can put it that way, from all haemophilia centres, I think. So the fact that there's nothing here doesn't indicate that none was used.
Is it your recollection that Ddavp was used prior to 1982, which is the first time it features here?
Oh, I can assure you, I undertook some studies in Cardiff, which published in British Journal of Haematology in 1980 with Professor Bloom. The UK GDO was kind enough to invite me to give a lecture on its use at their symposium, annual general meeting in Glasgow in 1980. So I felt I was well up in the potential use for Ddavp and was using it.
So if we could have Seamus WITN 3428044. So this is a table which has been prepared from the data in the document we've just looked at. It's been prepared by my colleague, Mr. Hill, and you've seen it, Professor. And we can see, if we look at the period 1979 to 1980, we see in 1979 the amount of cryoprecipitate use, 694,190 units. That's 78% compared to 22% of the product being factor 8 concentrate. 1980, we see there a very substantial increase in cryoprecipitate, but a much greater increase in the use of factor 8 concentrate. And the ratio is now 40% cryo, 60% factor 8. 1981, we can see the figures there set out, and the ratio is 36% cryoprecipitate, 64% factor 8 concentrates. 1982, we can see the figure for cryo, or the proportion has gone down again, and the actual overall volume has gone down again. It's now 26%, 69% factor 8, and then we have some figures for Ddavp and FIBA. 1983, we can see significantly less cryoprecipitate being used, so 341,700 compared to over 612,000 the year before. It's now 15% as opposed to 83% factor concentrates, again with a small amount of other products. And then 1984, the figure for cryoprecipitate has gone down to 139,000. It now represents 5% of product usage. Factor 8 concentrates are 91%, and we can see the figure there is just over 2.5 million units. So is it fair to summarise the picture between 1980 and 1984, when you were in charge, as being a decreasing usage of cryoprecipitate and a significant increase in the use of factor concentrates.
Yes.
And then if we look at the second table, that just gives us the information of PFC versus commercial product. We can see 1979, it's 100% PFC. 1980, it's 90% or 90.9% PFC, 9.1% commercial. We can then see in 1981 that there's a significant increase in the amount of commercial used, 65.5% PFC, 34.5% commercial. And then the proportion reduces markedly in 1982, 83 and 84, with it being 0.5% commercial, 7.9% commercial and 1.5% commercial in each year. And you're happy that represents accurately, summarises accurately the information that's in the larger table supplied to the Penrose inquiry?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if we just look for, I think, ease of reference at one paragraph in the Penrose report, which seeks to summarise the picture in relation to Edinburgh, it's PRSE 307002, please, Shumik. And if you could try page 552. No, if we go on, please, about another 5 or 6 pages. It's page 541 using the internal pagination, in fact, Shumik, at the bottom of the page. So we go on 5 pages. Back 1 page. That's it. Paragraph 1220. I'll just read this aloud, Professor Ludlam. Professor Ludlam's predecessor as director of the Edinburgh Haemophilia Centre, Dr. Howard Davis, made almost exclusive use of locally produced therapeutic materials. Professor Ludlam stated that Dr. Davis avoided the use of imported materials as a matter of policy, believing those derived from Scottish donors would be safer. Dr. Davis's argument in preference of locally sourced materials centred on the risks associated with hepatitis viruses, but appears to have had a more general basis. Both Professor Ludlam and Dr. McClellan stated that Dr. Davis was reluctant to potentially introduce novel viruses to the local population. Dr. Brian McClelland, who worked with Dr. Davis early in his, Dr. McClelland's career, said that Dr. Davis's policy struck him as eminently sensible. In relation to imported products, he thought the policy was grounded in elementary biology and that the further afield the blood came from, there was a certainly incalculable but reasonable grounds to expect that something new and different and unfamiliar to the indigenous population might be in that blood. And then it says this: Dr. Davis also tended to avoid large pool concentrates, preferring where possible to use cryo precipitate, in the belief that large pools of donations were more likely to contain transmissible viruses, whatever their source. As noted above, when Professor Ludlam succeeded Dr. Davis, he quickly reversed this part of Dr. Davis's policy and moved as many patients as he could to home therapy with concentrates. He continued, however, to prefer locally produced products, believing that the general population of Scotland was at the time relatively stable and that the risks associated with the local donor pool were small. Dr. Davis's thinking on this was, he said, for its time very sensible, otherwise I wouldn't have continued it. Now, I've taken you to that summary of the evidence, really to shortcut the need to go to the more lengthy exposition in the oral transcripts or in your various statements for the Penrose inquiry. Does that accurately set out in summary form your understanding of Dr. Davis's approach and your own reversal of Dr. Davis's policy in relation to the use of cryoprecipitate?
I don't recall Dr. Davis having reservations about the use of concentrates from large pools of donors. but I certainly remember his view that it was better to use locally produced products, partly to reduce the risk of viral infection, but also he made the very good point that the local people with haemophilia may have a degree of resistance, local resistance to local viruses that might appear in the blood, if I can put it that way. Yes, I moved away from Cryo Precipitate because I wanted to give patients the benefit of treatment at home, because I thought that was very advantageous.
I think, in fact, the element of this paragraph which is referring to Dr. Davis's avoidance of large pool concentrates is probably derived from Dr. McClellan's evidence rather than your own, and may explain the position. Looking then at the figures that we've looked at and at that summary of the evidence, is it fair to say that in the early 1980s, that there were the following three features of your approach? Firstly, you moved from a system based on cryoprecipitate as the main treatment for haemophilia A to a system of predominantly PFC factor VIII concentrates.
Yes.
Secondly, you substantially increased the number of patients on home treatment.
Yes.
And thirdly, you increased usage of factor concentrates as a whole substantially.
Yes.
And would it follow that that substantial increase in the use of factor concentrates would require more and more plasma to be collected to supply the concentrates that you required for the home treatment programme?
Yes.
And that also resulted in commercial concentrates being used for the first time, albeit only in large number in one particular year?
No. The concentrates, the commercial concentrates, were used for very specific purposes, almost exclusively. There were a couple of patients who were desperate to have home treatment in about 1980 or 81, 1981 or 82. Desperate. They lived quite a long way from Edinburgh. They were forever travelling and getting speeding fines for coming to Edinburgh to get their treatment, and they pleaded with me, could I not give them home treatment? So I explained that I could, but they would have to have commercial factor VIII, and they were quite happy to accept that. But apart from, I think, those two individuals, most of the rest of the commercial factor VIII that was used for rather specific reasons, which really arose out of the quality of the PFC factor VIII not being suitable for what I was wanting to do.
Was the reason for using commercial concentrates for the two individuals you've described, because you didn't have enough PFC concentrate?
Yes.
Yeah. So your preference would still have been for PFC concentrate if that had been available?
Oh, yes. Yes, certainly.
I just want to explore with you in a little more detail your implementation of the home therapy programme. If we could have, please, Shomek, PRSE 40492, please. So we can see, if we just zoom in a little closer on the text, thank you. It's a letter 1st of February 1980. It's not from you, but it is about you. It's from Dr. Bolton to Mr. Watt. Dr. Christopher Ludlam, whom I'm sure you know is the haematologist in place of Dr. Davis here, wishes to start an active home therapy programme for some of his haemophilic patients He's approached me today with a specific proposition for brothers who are in need of regular factor VIII therapy. And then there is a reference to the precise amounts needed. And then if we go into the next paragraph, I'm anxious to support such a programme as much as possible. Feel you ought to know that I see no reason to discourage Dr. Ludlam from going ahead with this programme. I feel that he's very likely to expand his home therapy programme considerably in the course of the next year, and this may well result in a significant difference in the pattern of our factor VIII usage, i.e. less cryo, more concentrate, and this of course may mean that we should be prepared to ship you more fresh frozen plasma for fractionation. Now, first of all, although this wasn't your letter, is that an accurate account of your initial approach in 1980?
Yes.
And is it also accurate that you did, as predicted by Dr. Boulton, seek to expand the home therapy programme considerably over the year or two that followed?
Certainly. When I arrived in Edinburgh, there were 6 patients on home therapy, and by 1983, I think we'd increased the number to about 40 or 45. There is a table in the Penrose report giving the number of patients on home therapy each year, but it went from about 60 up to about 40 or 45.
From about 6? Sorry, you just said 60.
6, I'm sorry, 6.
What categories of patients received home therapy in those early years in the 80s? How did you decide who would have home therapy and who would not?
It was difficult, and it was you had to take a number of factors into account: the distance the patients came, the age of the patient, their frequency of attendance with bleeds, whether they were able to inject themselves or whether the parents would be able to inject their children. So it was a variety of issues that needed to be considered.
Were they all patients with severe haemophilia A?
No, one or two had severe haemophilia B. We had one patient with severe von Willebrand disease, which requires treatment a bit like severe haemophilia A on occasions, but most of them had severe haemophilia A.
And did you have any patients with mild or moderate haemophilia on home treatment programs?
Certainly have patients with moderate haemophilia on home treatment, and I think latterly we might have had some mild patients, but mild patients don't bleed very often. When they do bleed, they may bleed very badly, but because people with mild haemophilia don't bleed very often, the patients are not well practiced at injecting themselves or making up the treatment. So on the whole, patients with mild haemophilia aren't usually on home therapy.
Now, you've said in your witness statement that Cryo Precipitate wasn't made available for home treatment, principally because of the risk of allergic reactions. Now, other witnesses, or some other witnesses, have placed more emphasis on the convenience of concentrates over Cryo Precipitate for home therapy. So, can I just explore with you what the concern was about allergic reactions? How common, in fact, were such reactions?
Very common. It was almost not quite routine. It was certainly routine with some patients that you had to give them an injection, or they gave an injection to themselves of antihistamine, Piriton, before they gave the Cryo Precipitate. And on occasions, not infrequently, we would need to give hydrocortisone to if a patient got a reaction, to try and damp down the reaction. I think the reason why I didn't dwell upon the issue of making up the cryoprecipitate is because that was done in the blood bank and by the blood transfusion service. So immensely grateful to them for doing that, because it's a very labor-intensive process. But cryoprecipitate reactions were very common. I didn't see a fatality. I have colleagues who have had patients collapse on them, a bit like a peanut allergy, anaphylaxis, requiring adrenaline and hydrocortisone. Reactions were very common and unpleasant.
What form typically did common reactions take?
A feeling unwell, getting a temperature, possibly the shakes, a rash, all of which might last several hours or half a day. Didn't usually require the patient to stay in hospital. Occasionally, someone had a bad reaction, you had to ask them to stay. But mostly they just felt unwell with it. It was not good.
If we look at your statement, Professor Ludlam, WITN 3428001. And if we go to page 37, please, Shomek. Paragraph 100, bottom of the page. You say this by reference to cryoprecipitate, picking it up in the third line. Cryoprecipitate transformed the treatment of patients with haemophilia A and allowed most bleeds in non-inhibitor patients to be treated effectively. So notwithstanding your concerns about reactions, cryoprecipitate did achieve the objective in relation to most bleeds of treating the bleed, did it not?
By the time the patient reached hospital, in a non-inhibitor patient, then cryoprecipitate would usually stop the bleeding. The problem, one of the other problems, as I think other witnesses have alluded to, is you didn't actually know how much factor VIII there was in the cryoprecipitate. The normal plasma level of factor VIII in the blood donors varies between 50% of normal and 150% of normal. So the amount of factor VIII in the cryoprecipitate of each individual donation could vary that much. In other words, a threefold difference. And so when you get cryoprecipitate, you really very little idea of exactly how much factor VIII there is in it. And I notice one of the witnesses said that they had 60 units per donation in their cryoprecipitate, and another said 70. I think on a good day, our local blood transfusion, because they'd improved the yield, they were potentially up to 100 units. So we really didn't know how much there was in the cryoprecipitates. You didn't know how much you were actually giving to the patient, which might lead you to potentially over-treat the patients.
Did you yourself have any direct experience of using cryoprecipitate for home treatment?
No.
Were you aware at the time, so 1980, early 1980s, that cryoprecipitate had been used, it would seem relatively successfully, for home treatment in the Royal Free Hospital and also in the Birmingham area?
I knew that people, small number of centres had used home treatment. I didn't know anything about the details.
If we just look at the previous page of your statement, it's paragraph 93, please, Shumik. You'll see in paragraph 3, it says, during the early 1980s, strenuous efforts were made by SNBTS to increase factor VIII concentrate production, and the resulting increase allowed more patients to benefit from home therapy. Donor blood plasma was redirected from cryoprecipitate production to concentrate manufacture. In relation to that second sentence, Professor Ludlam, whose decision was it to redirect donor blood plasma from cryoprecipitate production to concentrate manufacture?
That was a blood transfusion decision, but it was informed and discussed with me and with the other haemophilia directors in Scotland.
One of the reasons, if not the principal reason for that change of direction, would have been your reversal of Dr. Davis's policy and your switch from cryoprecipitate to factor concentrates, presumably.
Yes.
And then I just want to look with you, Professor, at some correspondence from 1982 about the allocation of factor concentrates in the home therapy programme. If we pick it up, Shumik, at PRSC 3044, please. So this is a letter we looked at before for a different purpose, and we'll just look back at it in a little more detail. So this is Dr. Bolton writing to you in May 1982. For the benefit of anyone listening who doesn't know, can you just confirm for us what Dr. Bolton's position was?
Yes, he was Deputy Director of the Blood Transfusion Centre, South East Scotland.
And we can see he is writing to you in May 1982 with a table of haemophilia home therapy patients. And he's got 24 names. This is the last sentence of the first paragraph, Professor, of whom 20 actually received some home therapy this year so far. And then he says, my concern is the amount of factor VIII that's been issued. The total for the first quarter was 206,800 units. This would be an annual consumption of 827,200 units. This means that for each of the 20 patients, the average annual consumption would be 41,360 units. And then he gives a variation on the figure, obviously pretty close to the UK national average. And then he says this, however, the amount of factor VIII that we were officially issued in the first quarter of this year was only 261,530 units, although we did get some more from Inverness. Hence, you will see that your home therapy programme alone has accounted for about 80% of our allocation from PFC. Then we have the passage we looked at earlier, Professor, about the allocation being based on the amount of plasma supplied. And then if we go on to the next page, oh, no, thank you. We could just zoom in a little bit closer to make it easier to read, thank you. He continues, I think that the SNBTS as a whole can just about hold your requirements as long as the following points are borne in mind. Maximum use is made of the cryoprecipitate programme, no more patients are put on home therapy, no patients are put on the cold operating lists. We try to borrow from other regions who may have lower haemophilic loads, particularly if we are treating their patients. Some of the heaviest users are counselled to use less. And then if we go to the next long paragraph, the first sentence, I feel therefore that you should be warned that we are now very definitely at the limits of our production for home therapy, and therefore you may consider the necessity for buying some commercial product. We do anticipate increasing our return of plasma to PFC, maybe doubling production by the middle of 1983. However, this would involve a radical reorganisation of our plasma procurement programme and cannot at this stage be relied on. Now, we'll look at some later correspondence from 1982 in a moment, but what, if anything, can you recall about this issue that Dr. Bolton was raising with you, in which he was essentially saying your home treatment programme is using up most of our allocation, and asking you to take the steps there set out?
I think this reflects very well the difficulties the blood transfusion service were under in being able to supply factor VIII concentrate to me for the patients. The pressure I was under from the patients, who were very keen indeed to have home therapy, which was commonplace in the rest of the country. And so I did my best to fulfill that request, and to do so, I had to juggle. Maybe we're going to come on to it. There were difficulties in the supply arrangements in the early 1980s from PFC. The other thing I think that point that is very pertinent is that you can't tell actually when patients are going to bleed with haemophilia, and sometimes patients come in with a major bleed or need an operation, and suddenly you need 50,000 units of factor VIII that you hadn't anticipated needing. So there was difficulties on the supply side, and the difficulties, if I can put it this way, in being able to accurately predict usage.
What was the Cryo Precipitate programme in capital letters there being referred to by Dr. Bolton there?
That was just the, I'm not sure why there are capital letters. There was no formal cryoprecipitate program. It was the outpatient and inpatient, I would hasten to add, treatment with cryoprecipitate. And one of the ways in which we eked out the PFC allocation was if patients were in hospital, we would treat them with cryoprecipitate if they didn't react too badly to it, or if didn't get reactions at all, and save the concentrate for patients to use at home.
Did you adopt the points 1, 2, 3, and 5 of this list? I think 4 is probably not so much for you. Did you try and use maximum use of cryoprecipitate, not put further patients on home therapy, not put patients on the cold operating lists, and counsel your patients to use less?
I'm not sure I counsel the patients to use less, because the doses that were being used for home treatment of bleeds were pretty minimal doses. They're perhaps a quarter of what one would use nowadays. I can't remember. I'm sure I had a pause in putting more patients on home therapy, because there was clearly when Dr. Bolton wrote this letter, there was clearly a bit of a crisis.
If we just follow through some of the correspondence, we won't look at all of it, but in 1982, if we go next to PRSE 303294, please, Shomek. If we zoom in on the text, it's not the clearest of letters, but I think it's probably August 1982, because that fits in with other communications. Again, it's from Dr. Bolton. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself. I just want to write concerning the present status of factor VIII usage. In July, I'm not sure whether that's 350 bottles, but the precise amount may not matter, we used, which is approximately 160% of our monthly allocation from PFC. We were only able to supply this amount because of a slight surfeit of factor VIII from other regions. We've enough to cover normal needs for the next 3 weeks or so, and you have, of course, got your commercial stock of high purity factor 8, and we have the Spaywood material in our deep freeze we must talk soon after my return. So it would appear that the issue about usage was still a concern to Dr. Bolton a couple of months after his May letter in August of 1982. The Spaywood material was what?
That would be porcine factor 8.
Did you use that simply for inhibitor patients, or did you use it at all for inhibitor patients at this time?
It was only used for patients with inhibitors. It had a particular place for patients with acquired haemophilia. But I didn't use it for non-inhibitor patients.
If we then just move, still in the same month, to PRSE 0001840. We can see this is the notes of a meeting with Dr. Christopher Ludlam on the 23rd of August at 2 p.m. Again, it would seem likely it's 1982, given the correspondence. And it's authored by Dr. Bolton. We won't go through the detail of every paragraph. If we go to the second page, please, Shomik, we can pick up what was agreed. So it's paragraph 6. The following was agreed. A, the 200 commercial bottles or equivalent should be maintained as the bedrock emergency stock. B, CL will make additional efforts to keep within the monthly allocation from PFC. C, FEB, that's Dr. Bolton, to continue exploring the possibilities of obtaining PFC factor 8 from other regions. However, he warned that this would be increasingly difficult and should not be relied upon. D, FEB warned that there will almost certainly be a need to buy more commercial factor 8 if the current usage pattern continues. Do you recall that meeting or these discussions with Dr. Bolton at this time?
I recall the discussions, and if you could go back one page. Yes, paragraph 2. Dr. Bolton,
FEB reminded CAL that the monthly allocations due from PFC of factor 8 is 380 bottles until September, i.e. about 84,000 units. Then from October, the allocation will be reduced to 330 bottles, about 73,000 units. Was that the passage, Professor?
That was the passage. I notice it's got 2 marks beside it. I don't know what further correspondence you're going to show, but my understanding is that the allocation would have been 500 bottles per month, and I could take you to evidence for that, but perhaps we should proceed with your correspondence first.
So if we go back to the second page, just want to ask you about points B and C in paragraph 6. It said that you've agreed to make additional efforts to keep within the monthly allocation from PFC. As far as you can recall, did you do so, and what were those efforts?
I can't remember, but it's I would try and use as much cryo precipitate as I could for treating patients when they're in hospital. And once you put patients on home therapy, you very reluctant. I don't think I've ever actually had to do it, to take them off home therapy, but that's the ultimate. Or you buy commercial concentrate and give the patients home treatment with commercial concentrate. But I've, as you know, been keen to avoid. So I was between a rock and a hard place.
In relation to point C, the possibility of obtaining PFC factor VIII from other regions, and there is some further correspondence which refers to that. We don't perhaps need to go through it in detail. But that was something that the correspondence suggests was undertaken by Dr. Bolton. But did you have discussions with your colleagues in other regions about the repercussions for the treatment of their patients if PFC factor was diverted away from other regions to Edinburgh?
I think it would only be redirected from other regions if they appeared to have stock on the shelves that wasn't needed in the very near future. This was a blood transfusion stock control arrangement, if I can put it that way. It wasn't discussed by haemophilia directors.
If we then go to PRSC 303269, we can pick this up now in December of 1982. This is a further letter from Dr. Bolton to you. And he says, with your current demand from X and X at 1,500 units and 1,500 units 80 and 1,000 units 80 each respectively, we will have exhausted our current stock by the 7th of January. He says he's arranged for more bottles and another consignment will be arriving from the usual monthly stock. And then he says, if demand for the two lads continues at its current rate, I have a nasty feeling you'll be needing to use your commercial reserves. John Watt informs me today that such an action may well be necessary in view of the anticipated large dispatching to the other centres at the beginning of January. Finally, I hope you won't feel it an impertinence of me to suggest this, but I would not be too surprised if in the event of X not responding to the conservative therapy, there might be a case for actually suspending factor VIII therapy. Now, I'm not asking you to comment on individuals, but more the general situation that we see described here. Dr. Bolton expressing a concern that the continued usage is going to exhaust stocks, essentially. Can you recall what, if any, steps were taken in response to these concerns in early 1983?
I can't say more than I've already said, I think. I think it likely I wouldn't have put, obviously, more patients, starting them on home therapy. I don't recall why Dr. Bolton made the suggestion in the penultimate paragraph. It was living in a very difficult environment of a precious, limited resource in demand. I and Dr. Bolton were in the middle of it.
We'll look at one further letter from December 1982 from Dr. Bolton. It's not to you, but it's at PRSE 0001487. So this is the 7th of December 82. It's Dr. Bolton to Mr. Watt at PFC. Dear John, just to let you know the latest manoeuvrings with regard to our centre supply of PFC factor VIII. Christopher Ludlam is beginning to use somewhat less of the PFC material in favour of cryoprecipitate, particularly for the inpatients. It is early days yet, but at least it is an encouraging trend. And then there's a discussion of offers from Glasgow and from Inverness of contributions to provide a temporary increase in reserves. What, if any, observation do you have on that second paragraph, which suggests that you were being encouraged to try and use more cryoprecipitate, particularly for the inpatient? So Doesn't sound like it was exclusively for inpatients.
That's what I was trying to convey by my answer a few minutes ago, that when patients were in hospital, if they didn't react to cryoprecipitate, that we would try and treat them with cryoprecipitate rather than factor VIII concentrate, even though they may have been getting concentrate at home for home therapy. That was a way of trying to conserve the stocks of concentrate.
If we go finally to one other letter, PRSE 303653. This is the letter of the 2nd of February 1983. So we've moved on a year. If we just go to the bottom of the page, please, Shemik, so we can see who it's from. So it's Dr. McClelland, copied to Dr. Bolton, addressed to Mr. Watt. And it says this: Dear John, following the joint... Sorry, can we just see the whole text? Thank you. Following the joint meeting of Haemophilia and transfusion directors, I've been thinking about the request made by the chairman that you and I with Chris Ludlam should review Edinburgh Factor VIII use. On reflection, I'm not sure that this meeting can help much, since I'm satisfied that Frank Bolton has worked hard and consistently to negotiate a reasonable approach to Factor VIII provision with Chris. To back up this statement, I'm enclosing, with Frank's permission, a selection of correspondence with Chris, which documents some of their regular joint sessions on the topic. I really do feel that seeing these, you will agree that one cannot readily accept the implication that Chris was inadequately informed of the supply situation, or that he was forced to purchase and stockpile locally because of SNBTS failure to delivery. My conclusion is that while I'm more than happy to meet with you and Chris and Frank to attempt to resolve the problems, this really isn't the whole answer to the difficulties. I would suggest that there is a need for a peer review by the Haemophilia directors, producing some clear guidance as to a reasonable level of consumption for the SE haemophiliac population. Now, we don't have, Professor Ludlam, all the correspondence to which this letter, the earlier correspondence to which the letter refers. But it would appear from this that there were continuing concerns that you were using too much Factor VIII concentrates. Was that your understanding of the SNBTS view at the time?
That was their view. If this is the last of the letters that you're going to show on this correspondence, could I ask for a document, please, which is PRSE 5028.
Yes, we didn't have this earlier, but I'm hoping we now do have it, Shemik. We do, I think.
This is a letter to John Watt, Director of PFC, from John Cash, who was the National Medical Director. It's about supplies of Factor VIII pro rata system. Perhaps I could read it out. I'd be most grateful for your thoughts on a difficult problem that is emerging in the Edinburgh Haemophilia Centre. There is no doubt that Chris Ludlam had, by the time we had our pro rata meeting in April 1982, started a very large number of new patients on home therapy. He had done so on the basis that he knew by March 31st, 1982, the Edinburgh Haemophilia Centre had sent over 6,000 kilograms of fresh frozen plasma to PFC in that year. He did his sums and concluded that on a pro rata basis, he could look forward to a monthly issue beginning April 1982 of at least 500 bottles per month. New paragraph. You will not be surprised to learn that Chris is on schedule. His monthly consumption is exactly 500 bottles. Unless something can be done, then he will have to switch some of his home therapy patients to commercial concentrate. and it goes on about difficulties in industrial action at PFC. So, as you see, in 1982, it was reasonable, as a result of discussions, that Edinburgh would receive about 500 bottles per month. And you'll recall in the previous correspondence you have showed me that Dr. Bolton was suggesting my allocation was only 380 bottles and that it was due to fall to 330 bottles. I was therefore not getting the supply of PFC material that I felt had been agreed. Now, there are a number of reasons for that that we could go into, but I'm not sure that it's relevant at the moment. But that is the difficulty. I was, from my perspective, promised 500 bottles a month. Delivery was much less than that, and that's why there came to be a difficulty.
How, if at all, was that difficulty resolved?
I think the PFC eventually was able to provide more concentrate. I haven't got the figures in front of me, although it is interesting of the table you showed me before of factor VIII usage. This is I don't know whether you want to look at it. WITN 342844. And as you will see in the lower table, second column, PFC units, it was 200,000 in 1979, 1.6 million in 1980, 1.6 million in 1982. There was a distinct supply problem in 1981 of PFC factor VIII. So I think this, and as you can see, the supply improved.
The letter.
Sorry,
carry on.
Table 2, the lower table is the one I was looking at. Yeah, I think you can see that the delivery of PFC material did increase from 1982 to 83 and quite significantly in 1984. But in 1981 there was much less made available.
What was your understanding of the reasons for any difficulties in providing you with the amount of concentrate that you wanted from PFC?
I'm sorry, the acoustics weren't very good. Could you repeat your question?
Yes, of course. What was your understanding of the reasons why PFC were not able to provide you with the amount of concentrates that you'd wanted?
I think it was, I think there were manufacturing difficulties at PFC. And I'm sorry, I don't have the plasma supply figures available or in my memory. I don't know whether there was a paucity of supply of plasma from Southeast Scotland Transfusion Centre.
In general, in terms of your treatment of patients, whether as outpatients, inpatients or on home treatment, how did you monitor the amount of factor VIII usage and keep it to the minimum level necessary?
Well, this was one of the big advantages in having a haemophilia sister, because she would see the patients when they would come up to collect further supply of home treatment, usually about once a month, and they would bring with them a record of how they had used their treatment, what the bleeds had been when they treated, how much they'd given themselves. So that way we monitored how the patients were using the therapy.
So I note the time. I haven't been keeping my eye on the clock. It's 1:10.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now, but while we still have this document on the screen, if you look at the top table, Table 1, and just do a quick rough calculation of the number of units used in 1980 compared to the number of units used in 81, there was about 3 million in 1980. 1981, it's about 2 million, possibly, in fact, almost exactly 2 million, I think. Why the drop? Do you remember? Why were you using less?
Well, it illustrates, I think, 2 points. One is that demand or usage goes up and down and is a bit unpredictable. The other, and we've not discussed this, but why the factor VIII, the commercial factor VIII, was being used. And in 1980, we had 2 patients who went for surgery, and they ran into very severe post-operative problems arising. I treated them with PFC, factor VIII concentrate. Unfortunately, they ran into what's called the Hyperviscosity Syndrome, which I hadn't come across in treating haemophilia before, because in Cardiff I'd been used to using much higher purity concentrates. But the PFC concentrates were of relatively low purity, and when you give twice or thrice daily injections for a week or 2 on end, what happens is that the fibrinogen level increases, and the fibrinogen level also increases as a response to the stress of the operation. These 2 patients had operations a week apart, and after about 10 days, the first one started bleeding from this hyperviscosity syndrome, which I had, as I say, I had never experienced. I was perplexed as to why the patient was bleeding despite a reasonable factor VIII level. And eventually I realized it was this hyperviscosity. And so both these patients had to be plasmapheresed, have their plasma exchanged. And I had to buy in commercial concentrate, high purity or much higher purity commercial concentrate, to rescue these 2 patients, post-operative patients, from their bleeding difficulties.
I see. Thank you very much. Well, we'll take a break now. We'll take a break until 2:10, if that's okay, long enough for you to get a bite or a refreshment and stretch your legs. And the same for us and for those who are watching. So 2:10.